The moment I finally understood how deeply my family could abandon me happened on the day I was supposed to feel the most loved, the day I married the man I chose. My name is Courtney. I am 32, and never in my life did I imagine I would walk down the aisle knowing my parents were thousands of miles away simply because they preferred to be elsewhere. They were not stuck at work or facing any emergency. They were on a beach with my sister, smiling in photos posted online at the exact moment I stood in my wedding dress trying to steady myself. I remember opening my phone in the bridal room and seeing a message from my mother that said, "We cannot make it. The trip is already booked." No apology. No explanation. Just a decision clear enough to show exactly where I stood in their hearts. My father did not bother to send even a single sentence. I stared at the screen while the makeup artist hesitated behind me, unsure if she should continue. All I could think was how many warning signs I had ignored over the years that led to this moment. What shocked me most was not that they chose the trip, but what came 3 months after the wedding when they reached out and told me I should show up and cover most of the cost for my sister's wedding. They skipped my wedding to go on vacation with her, yet 3 months later they expected me to pay for hers. Absolutely ridiculous. What would you do if your family treated you this way? Share your thoughts in the comments because this story is far from over. To understand why everything unfolded the way it did, I need to talk about my family first. My sister Marissa shaped the way our home functioned, long before either of us realized it, and my parents built an unspoken system where her needs quietly directed the rhythm of our lives. Mom often claimed she was simply being practical, and Dad usually stayed silent whenever tension surfaced, yet the pattern grew more obvious as I got older. I learned early that moments designed to be shared equally rarely turned out that way, because Marissa always stepped into the center while I adjusted myself to whatever space was left. When we were children, school events revealed these differences with surprising clarity. Mom missed an entire afternoon performance I had practiced for weeks because Marissa had forgotten a jacket and wanted Mom to bring it to her. I remember standing backstage wondering whether Mom would appear in the crowd, and I kept telling myself there must have been a real emergency. Dad sat near the back with his eyes fixed on the floor as if he hoped it would swallow him. I did my part on stage while convincing myself it did not matter, even though it did more than I admitted. Years later, a birthday dinner that I had planned became another reminder when Marissa announced she had arrived late because she needed to finish shopping for herself, and my parents immediately shifted the attention to ask what she bought. I sat there with a smile that felt heavy because every conversation returned to her as if guided by instinct. As we entered adulthood, the contrast between our paths deepened. I moved to Orlando with a careful plan to support myself and build something steady. I worked long hours, earned promotions, and eventually settled into a life that felt reliable. Meanwhile, Marissa stayed close to Mom, and Mom supported each job change she made, even when it was her fourth position in 1 year. Mom often praised her for being resilient while I watched quietly because saying anything only turned into an argument about generosity and love. Dad continued observing from the sidelines and rarely offered opinions, which made me feel like he vanished whenever I needed him to take a stance. Family gatherings became an unintentional stage for repetition. Whenever I visited, the conversations drifted to whatever Marissa had been doing recently. If she took a short trip, the entire evening revolved around it. If she considered starting something new, the entire table discussed how exciting it sounded. When I shared progress at work, Mom said she was proud, but her voice carried the tone of someone acknowledging something necessary rather than something meaningful. I stopped expecting more because disappointment grows quiet when repeated over time. It settled into me like a habit I accepted without argument. Living away gave me perspective, though it also created distance I could never fully close. My life expanded as my responsibilities became my own, and I learned how much peace comes from relying on myself. Yet every holiday dinner reintroduced the imbalance I tried to ignore. Marissa arrived with new requests for help, and Mom immediately considered them reasonable. I rarely heard anyone ask how I managed my own challenges, and when I tried to explain that adulthood came with pressure I carried alone, Mom told me I had always been independent, as if that relieved them from understanding me at all. By the time I reached my early 30s, I accepted that the structure of my family was not temporary. It was a long-standing system shaped by choices repeated year after year, and even though I tried to rationalize it, the imbalance created cracks in my relationship with Mom and Dad that only widened with time. Nothing prepared me for how those cracks would shape the decisions they later made, but looking back, every sign pointed toward the moment when their priorities finally became undeniable. 3 months before the wedding, everything started shifting off balance. I remember sitting at the dining table with my fiancé Mark, surrounded by lists, receipts, and timelines, because we had reached the stage where every decision mattered. We had chosen a venue, confirmed the date, and started shaping the details that made the day feel real. Mark remained patient through every conversation, and he tried to lighten my stress by reminding me that the celebration was about the two of us rather than the decoration, yet I still hoped my family would eventually show excitement. I wanted them to treat the occasion as something meaningful, and I believed their involvement would help me feel grounded. One evening, while we reviewed the seating chart, a message from Marissa appeared on my phone. She announced that she had booked a long vacation with her friends. The trip fell exactly on the same week as my wedding. She wrote that she needed time away and hoped I would understand. There was no mention of the date she already knew months in advance. I read her message twice before showing it to Mark because a part of me still wished I had misunderstood it. His expression tightened when he saw the text, and he asked whether she had forgotten the timing. I told him she had not forgotten because I had reminded her repeatedly. His silence said more than any sentence. The situation grew heavier when I called my mother to discuss it. Mom did not sound troubled at all. She said the vacation sounded exciting and insisted that Marissa deserved a relaxing break. When I reminded her that the trip overlapped with the wedding, she responded with a tone that made me feel unreasonable for expecting Marissa to adjust her plans. I felt something cold settle inside me because this was the first time the wedding was openly treated as something that could be pushed aside. I kept waiting for Mom to show concern, yet her excitement remained focused on Marissa's travel plans. Dad stayed in the background of the call and only spoke once to say he hoped everything would work out. His detachment felt familiar, yet it stung more than before. The following weeks became a quiet test of patience. Mark and I worked through the details without support, and I found myself handling tasks that I had once hoped to share with my family. Each vendor meeting carried a small ache because I could not shake the feeling that I was preparing for an event that mattered more to me than to the people who raised me. Mark noticed how tense I became and encouraged me to take breaks, yet I struggled to relax when my thoughts kept circling back to my parents and the silence on their end. I told myself not to expect what had never been consistently given, but disappointment rarely listens to logic. One Saturday afternoon, Mark suggested we stop by my parents' house to clear the air before my stress grew worse. When we arrived, Marissa was on a video call with her friends planning their itinerary. Mom watched with enthusiasm while giving suggestions for restaurants they should try. I waited for someone to acknowledge our arrival, yet the conversation continued as if we were visitors rather than family. When I mentioned the wedding preparations, Mom responded with a brief comment about being sure everything would be fine. Marissa lifted her head just long enough to say she hoped the event went smoothly before returning to her call. Mark stood beside me and offered a polite smile, but I could feel the tension in his posture. Later, when we got in the car, he told me he finally understood why certain memories still bothered me. His voice held both concern and frustration because he had expected my family to care more than they showed. That month revealed more than I wanted to see, and every interaction reminded me that the imbalance I tried to ignore had shaped my family for far too long. 2 weeks later, the tension within my family became far more visible as every conversation drifted in an uncomfortable direction that I struggled to clarify. I sensed a subtle change in the rhythm of their messages, because each time I shared an update about the wedding, the responses arrived with a distant tone that felt colder than I expected during such an important period. I tried to remain patient, yet a growing heaviness settled inside me, turning even the smallest exchange into a quiet reminder that something had shifted. The situation escalated when Marissa called one late Friday afternoon while I was reviewing the guest list with Mark. Her voice carried the same relaxed confidence she always used whenever she wanted something adjusted for her convenience. She chatted for a moment before dropping a suggestion that nearly made me lose my breath. She said the wedding week clashed with her upcoming trip, so I should consider moving the entire ceremony to a different date to protect her plans. I froze because her tone implied that my wedding was simply another event that could be rearranged for her comfort. Before I managed to answer, Mom joined the call with a level of enthusiasm that felt painfully misplaced. She spoke with a gentle tone, yet delivered a message that cut straight through me. Mom said, "You should be more flexible, honey." That single sentence settled on me like a confirmation of every fear I had ignored. She asked nothing about the venue, the deposits, or the work we had put into each detail. She offered no acknowledgement of how much the day mattered to me. Her only focus was ensuring Marissa would not face any inconvenience. Dad entered the call shortly after with his usual neutral attitude, avoiding any firm stance while offering vague comments that protected Marissa without explicitly saying so. His lack of support created a familiar ache because I recognized the pattern far too well. I waited for a moment of fairness from him, yet he remained distant while I struggled to navigate a conversation that had turned strangely surreal. Mark listened quietly beside me, absorbing every word with increasing frustration. Once Dad stopped talking, Mark leaned toward the phone and delivered a clear statement that carried more strength than anything said that afternoon. He said, "We're not changing our wedding date." He kept his voice even, yet the firmness within it filled the room. The silence that followed lasted only a short moment, though it revealed more than any argument could have expressed. That silence told me exactly who stood with me during this battle. Marissa eventually broke the quiet by shifting to what she called a compromise, although no part of it resembled anything reasonable. Instead of asking me to move the entire wedding, she suggested altering the rehearsal or adjusting the timing of the reception so her vacation schedule could remain untouched. She listed examples with an air of practicality, yet the proposal sounded so inconsiderate that I had to meet Mark's eyes to confirm I had not misunderstood. I explained that the arrangements had been finalized long before her trip existed, and any change would cause unnecessary expense and confusion. However, Marissa insisted that I should understand her situation because she had been looking forward to the getaway for months. She framed it as if I was the one creating conflict, even though I had not shifted a single detail since the engagement. Her insistence highlighted a truth I had tried to overlook. My feelings never shaped their decisions. After the call ended, an uneasy quiet settled over the room. I realized I had been pushed into the role of the person expected to adjust, absorb, and tolerate every demand for the sake of keeping peace. That pattern had followed me through childhood into adulthood, yet this moment finally exposed how deeply it had burrowed into my family's expectations. I sensed that something fundamental had changed inside me because the weight of their behavior no longer felt tolerable. As the wedding day approached, I held on to a quiet and almost fragile hope that my parents might change their minds. I tried to convince myself that a part of them still wanted to stand with me during one of the most meaningful moments of my life. That hope stayed with me during the nights when I reviewed the seating arrangements, confirmed guest details, and finalized decisions that many brides usually shared with their families. I moved through the week with a mixture of excitement and heaviness because I understood that every remaining task rested on my shoulders. I wanted to believe Mom or Dad would call to ask whether I needed anything, yet my phone stayed silent until the morning before the ceremony. When I opened the message that finally arrived, the few short words pulled the last thread of my hope apart. Mom wrote that they would not make it to the wedding and told me to enjoy the day. There was no warmth or acknowledgement of what that absence meant. The emptiness of her message forced me to accept what I had gradually understood during the months leading up to that moment. Mark stepped in quickly to keep my spirits from collapsing, and his family surrounded me with a level of care I had never experienced. His mother guided me through the remaining details with a steady calm that helped me breathe through the tension. His father organized the final arrivals for guests who flew in from out of town. I felt grateful in a way I had never expected because they treated me like someone who deserved support. Their presence softened the sting I carried inside me, although nothing could fully remove the truth that my own parents had chosen to be elsewhere. The ceremony unfolded beautifully, and I felt a steady strength holding me together as I walked toward Mark. His expression told me that he understood the complicated swirl of emotions inside me, yet he kept me grounded with the way he reached for my hand. When we exchanged our vows, I focused on the future we were building instead of the gaps in the room. I let myself lean into the love that surrounded us, even as a small ache followed me throughout the day. During the reception, that ache deepened in a way I had not prepared for. As I returned to my table after greeting several guests, Mark gently set my phone in front of me and told me that I did not need to look, but he would not hide anything from me. I unlocked the screen and saw a new set of posts from my sister Marissa. She had shared photos from the beach with captions about how perfect the weather was and how much fun they were having. The timestamp matched the beginning of my wedding ceremony. I stared at the images while my chest tightened with a kind of disappointment that felt colder than anger. For the rest of the evening, I moved through the celebration with a steady smile, determined not to let their absence overshadow the joy that everyone else poured into the day. Still, the contrast between Mark's supportive family and the silence from my own grew sharper with each passing hour. I understood that their decision went beyond a scheduling conflict or a misunderstanding. It reflected a truth I could no longer deny. When the night ended and guests began leaving, I sat beside Mark and allowed myself to acknowledge the pain I had pushed aside. I thought about every moment when I had tried to earn a place in my family's priorities, and for the first time I felt no desire to try again. That clarity shaped a decision that settled firmly in my mind. I chose to cut off contact with Mom, Dad, and Marissa because I finally saw how deeply their choices had defined my entire relationship with them. I stepped into married life with the understanding that removing myself from their patterns was the only way to protect the peace I wanted to build with Mark. 3 months after the wedding, I finally felt the rhythm of my life settling again. The quiet in our home no longer reminded me of the absence of my parents, but reflected a peace that Mark and I had created for ourselves. We both returned to our demanding schedules with a sense of partnership that made the days move steadily. I found focus in my work again, and Mark often reminded me that stability was something we were allowed to enjoy without apology. Our evenings were simple, calm, and free of the emotional tension that had weighed on me for years. That calm shifted one Thursday afternoon when my phone began vibrating in a way I recognized instantly. The contact name on the screen made my stomach tighten because I had not seen it appear since the wedding. It was Mom. I hesitated before opening the message, and for a brief moment I wondered if she wanted to mend something or acknowledge how deeply her choice had cut me. Instead, her message was short and strangely formal, as if nothing painful had occurred between us. She wrote that she hoped I was doing well and that there was something important she needed from me. The neutrality of her tone unsettled me more than anger would have. Within a minute, another message arrived from Dad, who had been silent for months. He repeated the same phrasing almost word for word, which told me the two of them had coordinated it. Before I could respond, Mom sent a follow-up asking whether we could all be adults and discuss a family matter that required my cooperation. The detachment in her choice of words made my heart sink, because it mirrored many conversations from the past where my needs never held weight. Later that evening, Mom finally revealed what they wanted. She wrote that Marissa's wedding was approaching and that they expected me to contribute a significant amount toward the expenses because family should support family. She framed it as if the decision had been mutually agreed upon, ignoring that I had not been consulted at all. The request was delivered as if it were obvious that I would comply, despite the fact that they had chosen a beach trip over attending my own ceremony. My pulse quickened as I read the message again. I could not believe they felt entitled to make such a demand after months of complete silence. I told them my answer would not change no matter how they phrased it. I explained that I would not be contributing financially and that the expectation itself was unreasonable. Within minutes, Mom responded with a long stream of texts accusing me of being ungrateful, dramatic, and selfish for holding grudges over one misunderstanding. She claimed that adults should not treat family so coldly and insisted that I owed support to Marissa because she is your sister. Dad stayed quiet, which had always been his pattern when things became confrontational. That weekend, my Aunt Joanne reached out for the first time in a while. She introduced herself gently by reminding me she was my father's sister, and added that she had heard bits and pieces of the situation. She asked whether I felt comfortable explaining my side. I trusted her more than most relatives, because she had never taken part in the favoritism that defined the household I grew up in. When I told her what Mom and Dad had demanded, she sighed with a weight that suggested she was not surprised. Joanne said she was aware of how the dynamics in our family had hurt me over the years, yet she also believed my parents were hoping to pull me back into the same roles I had finally stepped away from. By Monday, the tension had escalated further. Mom sent another message saying that refusing to help with Marissa's wedding meant I was distancing myself from the family permanently, as if the distance had not begun long before that conversation. Dad finally added that I should reconsider for the sake of family harmony. Their words made it clear they did not want reconciliation, but compliance. That realization settled heavily in me because it confirmed what I had long suspected. They did not miss me. They missed the version of me who carried the weight of their expectations without protest. In the weeks that followed that request, the consequences began to show clearly. I sensed a quiet shift in the family dynamic once the request faded into the background, and the first signs of tension appeared when Marissa struggled to manage the consequences of her lavish choices. My sister Marissa had spent without restraint during her long vacations and continued to push for a wedding far beyond anything reasonable, which created a pattern of bills she could not control. I heard fragments of conversations through relatives who lived nearby, describing the way unpaid vendors called repeatedly and how she attempted to negotiate deadlines with promises no one believed she could keep. I stayed distant from these developments while maintaining my focus on my marriage with Mark and our steady work routine that had brought us a renewed sense of stability. My parents soon faced their own difficulties as they tried to support Marissa emotionally while attempting to shield her from the pressure created by her financial mismanagement. Mom in particular became overwhelmed by the number of obligations she had taken on because she refused to recognize how much her indulgence had contributed to the problem. Dad tried to mediate between them, yet he lacked the resolve to establish boundaries, which allowed every issue to spill over into their daily life. Conversations within the extended family began to shift as relatives recognized how unbalanced the situation had become, and those who once admired my parents for their generosity now questioned their judgment. The discussion spread quietly across gatherings, shaping a reputation neither of them had anticipated. I felt no desire to intervene or correct the narrative because I understood that distancing myself was the only way to preserve the progress I had made since the wedding. My days passed peacefully with Mark as we created new routines that made our home feel grounded and secure. I directed my energy toward work projects that offered meaningful growth, and I realized how much lighter my life had become when I no longer carried the emotional weight of trying to meet expectations that were never designed to include my well-being. Each small accomplishment reminded me that I had taken the right step when I chose to separate from the chaos. My Aunt Joanne, who had always remained neutral, contacted me one afternoon and spoke in a calm tone that revealed how much she had observed without judgment. She explained that the tension among relatives had reached a level my parents could not ignore, and shared that several family members believed the consequences were a natural result of years spent prioritizing Marissa. Her insight helped me understand that the situation had grown larger than a simple disagreement, and that everyone involved was confronting the consequences of long-standing patterns. Although Joanne never pressured me to re-engage, she encouraged me to continue protecting the life I had built, which reaffirmed my commitment to maintaining healthy distance. As the weeks unfolded, Mom and Dad appeared to understand that I had stepped away from their influence completely, and they no longer attempted to draw me back into the imbalance that had once consumed our relationship. Their realization came not through confrontation, but through the gradual understanding that I was no longer available to shoulder responsibilities created by choices I had not made. I recognized the relief that accompanied this shift and allowed myself to accept that stepping away had been the most important decision I had made for my own well-being. 1 year after the wedding, I looked back at everything. A gentle shift had settled into my life in Orlando, and the calm surrounding me felt genuine rather than forced. I woke each morning with a sense of steadiness that had once seemed unreachable, and I often found myself surprised by how natural it felt to live without the weight of old expectations pressing on my shoulders. Mark and I created a rhythm that supported us without draining either of us, and our home slowly became a place where peace did not feel temporary or fragile. I learned to enjoy the quiet moments that used to be crowded with anxiety, and I welcomed the freedom that came when I no longer braced myself for criticism or sudden demands. Meanwhile, my sister Marissa struggled with the consequences of the choices she had insisted were harmless. Her extravagant trips and impulsive spending created a financial mess she tried to manage in ways that grew more complicated with each passing month. I heard pieces of the story through extended relatives who still kept an eye on family dynamics, and they mentioned the tension that rose whenever her future wedding plans came up in conversation. The unraveling of her relationship with her fiancé happened quietly at first, then gained momentum as the pressure mounted around expectations neither of them could meet. Mom and Dad faced their own difficulties, and the cracks in their decisions began to show in ways they could not hide from people around them. Their neighbors and local relatives noticed how often they defended choices that no longer made sense, especially when those choices had isolated them from the daughter who had once tried to please them. The community gossip did not surprise me, yet I refused to involve myself. I stayed detached, neither comforting them nor adding fuel to the growing conflict. It felt strange to watch everything unfold from a distance, but it also felt like the safest place for me to stand. My work flourished during this time, and the stability in my career mirrored the stability I felt at home. Each new achievement built a quiet confidence that had been weakened by years of subtle comparisons and dismissive remarks. I no longer needed validation from people who had failed to offer it when it mattered most. The contrast became even clearer one afternoon when I ran into a distant cousin at a cafe in Orlando. She mentioned that my parents often spoke about how independent I had become, a word they rarely used before. I realized their attempts to minimize me no longer held any influence, and that small moment confirmed how far I had moved beyond their reach. A part of me wondered if reconciliation would ever feel necessary, but the thought faded each time I remembered the peace I now protected. My boundaries had reshaped my entire life, and I refused to let anything disturb the clarity I had gained. Learning to set firm boundaries became the turning point that changed not only how I lived, but also how I saw myself. Walking away from environments that dismissed my worth allowed me to rebuild my confidence without interference, and I finally understood that distance can be a form of protection rather than punishment. Letting go of unhealthy patterns became an act of respect for my future, and the life I created proved that choosing peace is not selfish. Thank you for listening to my story and sharing this moment with me. Every journey toward healing is different, and I hope mine encourages you to trust your own boundaries. I would love to hear your perspective, so feel free to share your thoughts or experiences in the comments. Your voice matters here, and your insight might help someone facing a similar struggle.